I think, as I said, there's a lot to be said. I think we just have to begin with kind of the very, very core principle that it is immoral and unconscionable that in one of the wealthiest countries in the world that we have people sleeping on our streets. It is a tragedy, and it is wrong, and it is a collective responsibility that we all share to do more and to do better. And I know that tackling homelessness has been one of the top priorities of this board, and we know, and I know, we're not going to solve the homelessness crisis by criminalizing homelessness. We're going to solve the homelessness crisis by building housing that's affordable, by getting people into housing that's affordable, by getting people the mental health and behavioral health and addiction treatment services that they need, because people are not choosing to be homeless. We have seniors as one of the fastest growing segments of our homeless population. We have queer youth that have been kicked out of their homes who have nowhere to go. We have families living in cars trying to go to school. And as I said, this is trying to actually, in a very fundamental way, meet the real needs of people in this community has been one of my top priorities. With the diversion program, with the senior shelter rent subsidies, I am very focused on how we continue to expand shelter beds, like the project we recently stood up at Rosecrans. What else can we do around recuperative care? I think that's the bullet 3 that's identified in this board letter, is looking at how we find more shelter sites. And I'm going to be continuing to look very hard at that, looking at every single possible place of county land. But the core thing I want to center my remarks on is that the work that we have to do as a community and as a region is to actually get housing for folks and get help for folks, not criminalize homelessness. So I think that is, to me, the jumping off point. So then I just want to kind of, from there, I had a bunch of questions and thoughts and comments. I'm very heartened when I hear Supervisor Anderson talking about the intent of this ordinance, which he said is not to criminalize homelessness, but is to deal with fire risk and fire safety challenges in his region. And I will admit that upon first reading, that's not evident. So it's very helpful in hearing the intent of the author that this is really about fire risk and not about criminalizing homelessness. So I just want to comment for the record that I think that intent, that drafting intent about fire hazard and not about criminalizing homelessness, is a very important piece of information of which I was not aware. So I appreciate my colleague of sharing that. I think when we think about an ordinance like this, we have to look at how camping bans have been enforced and implemented in other jurisdictions, and some of the challenges that have emerged in the enforcement. When I had the opportunity to actually put my legal hat back on, which I don't get to do very much, and went back and read the Boise decision and the Grants Pass decision over the last week to try to kind of untangle this issue around enforceability. And so I know that if we were to move forward with drafting an ordinance today, it would be very important to me to have to really look carefully at enforceability, which is, I think, a very key outstanding question, because the way that the Boise decision is written, there's 2 options really around enforceability, and both lead to completely absurd outcomes, right? So there's the one approach that would say, essentially, you have to have enough shelter beds in your community for however many people who are unhoused. So it's a numerical threshold. Basically, the quote is, so long as there is a greater number of homeless individuals in a jurisdiction than the number of available beds and shelters, the jurisdiction cannot prosecute homeless individuals for involuntary sitting, sleeping, and lying in public. So if you have 100 homeless individuals but 50 shelter beds, that would not be permitted. It would not be enforceable, which obviously leads to some very absurd outcomes, because what if all of those shelter beds are only available for men, and some of the homeless individuals are women, or all those available shelter beds are in religious institutions, and you have queer young people who are not welcome. So a numerical threshold creates very absurd outcomes of people who don't actually have shelter beds available, even if you, from a numerical counting standpoint, do have more shelter beds. The other and that's in the text of Boise. But then there's the footnote in Boise, which kind of takes a opposite point of view, which says that the shelter must be realistically available for that individual specific person, which would seem on the face of it to potentially be a better approach, right? You have to make sure that the specific person in front of you actually has a shelter bed available. But that has, a corresponding equally absurd problem, which is, what if you have a situation where you're holding shelter beds open for the specific individuals in front of you, but other people who are not the ones that are being potentially cited or moved by enforcement are then being denied or turned away from shelter. So you might have 1,900 people trying to get a shelter bed, and you're keeping hundreds of beds open just so that you can cite people and put them into shelter. So that's also an equally absurd outcome and terrible from a human rights perspective and unconscionable. So, like I said, I was going to say a lot. But I do want to note that in addition to, I think, the emphasis that my colleague played on fire hazard and not on criminalization, we would absolutely have some set of options around enforceability and a range of options around enforceability that would make enforceability contingent on both prongs, both the footnote 8 and the text of Boise being represented as necessary prongs in order for such an ordinance to be enforceable. It's not either or, because either could be absurd. It would have to be both and. So apologies for people who did not spend a bunch of time reading legal briefs this past week, but I did think it was extremely important to say this on the record because this is, if we are to go down the path of drafting the ordinance, this would just be the very beginning of the beginning. The county does not work like the city. We're not voting on an ordinance today. This would be a very long and iterative process of drafts and drafts coming back. And I wanted to state for the record that making sure that both elements, both having enough beds for the whole population and having an available and appropriate bed for the specific individual, would both prongs of that would have to be met, in my opinion, for this to be not just legally pass muster, but frankly, for it to not be an absurd insult to people's human dignity and human rights in San Diego County. Which I think gets to some other comments that I wanted to make today, which is we know that any ordinance is not going to magically end homelessness. It cannot and it will not, and the real work is to continue building housing, building more affordable housing, trying to get people into housing, get people treatment, get people services, get people more shelter. And so to me, that is, to some extent, that is the work that we should really be spending our energy talking about and focused on. And I do appreciate that this board as a whole has been incredibly supportive across all different kinds of interventions. And I think we have to continue working on that. And as I said, I'm very interested in looking at county land and looking at 3 sites in particular. I'll be bringing a board item probably in December or January on potential sites that we can build more shelters on. And I'm more interested in the action we took a few weeks ago on diversion, where we're really looking at how do we keep people from falling into homelessness in the first place. So I think that those are, for me, the really important points of emphasis. I did have a couple questions for our county staff. I don't know, I think it might be appropriate. Helen might be the person to whom to direct it to. I wanted to better understand what tools we already have in the toolbox, because I do know we managed to, in my colleagues' districts, clear the Magnolia campsite. So wondered to just better understand what tools we already have in the toolbox.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Yes, we do have several tools, and we have several teams that work diligently to work from a very humanitarian type of response, certainly not a criminalization type of response. So I want to make that very clear. We've cleared culverts out in the unincorporated area. We have had some issues where fire was a concern. Health and safety is always prominent. We did the Magnolia encampment clearing not long ago that you just referenced, hepatitis A, COVID, various cleansing activities where we needed to help people move so that we could do that appropriate cleaning and whatnot. And then we've had private property owners that have had encampments on their properties. So there have been a variety of instances where we've had homeless encampments that we've had to go out and address. And we have teams that help us do that. Obviously, we have the homeless assistance resource teams from the Sheriff's Department. They're not officers that are going out there to arrest, they're officers that are going out there to try to help and advise. We have our own MCRT teams, our behavioral health specialists that go out there for people that are in medical crisis. We have our behavioral health specialists that go out there and help provide behavioral health treatment and wraparound services. One of the things that I think we do, we spend a lot of time with is our HSEC staff, our community outreach teams that go out and build up a rapport with them. And they do that over weeks, days, weeks, months to try to help folks that are on the street that maybe we can help them reconnect with a family member somewhere. Maybe we can help them get into services. Maybe there's some eligibility things that they aren't aware of that we can hook them into services that way. In Magnolia, we were very successful in getting a lot of people moved with housing vouchers. So we got them into some kind of voucher system. So those are some of the tools that we have used. And I will say it's complicated, especially some of the items that you mentioned when they have a pet. You know, it's hard for them sometimes. They're not going to leave the pet, many of them. That is their comfort. That is somebody that they're close to and attached to. And so when we're trying to move them, we need to help them connect to a place that will take a pet. Obviously, you mentioned gender. Some have disabilities. We have to make sure that wherever we're trying to help them move to can accommodate their needs. But we work really diligently to try to build a rapport with them through the various folks that are on the street with them, trying to get to know them and trying to understand what their special needs are. And those are some of the tools that we've used. I don't know whether you want, I mean,
No,
we
that
have
was very
DPW
helpful.
and others that go out there and do a tremendous job on private property where we have to clear. And of course, we always consult with council to make sure that we're following all the right rules and regulations. But I want to tell you, it is completely from a humanitarian and a health and safety perspective that we're bringing to that interaction.
Thank you. That was very helpful context. I just want to wrap up with kind of a few last comments. I just want to reiterate that, you know, if this was to move forward today, you know, from my perspective, there's sort of 4 pieces of legislative intent that would have to be really centered, right? One is the focus on fire safety and fire hazard. I think that my colleague made very clear. Secondly, that this is not about criminalizing people. And I think that's, again, what my colleague made very clear in his comments and as the proposer of this item. And then third, that we are really being thoughtful about avoiding absurdities with enforceability, and we're really creating clarity that we would need to meet both, you know, an individual availability and a population availability standard. And fourth, that we're centering people's humanity. That, you know, at the end of the day, this is a population that's incredibly vulnerable. They're in need of support. We know that 1/3 of our unhoused individuals are seniors. 1/3 become homeless due to health reasons. I was actually kind of looking at the numbers this past week as I was preparing for today, and I was shocked to see that 1 in 4 homeless women were pregnant during their episodes of homelessness. We know that our LGBTQ community is overrepresented, so that we really have to be centering how we get people into housing and into the help that they need, and not criminalizing people. And if we're talking just about sort of narrowly how we prevent fire risk and people being burned alive, you know, I'm open to continuing that conversation, but just wanted to, you know, really center that I'm focused on long-term solutions here, and that's where I think we need to be putting our energy.